wonderful prayers. It is indeed a great honor to welcome John Hatcher, a distinguished Baha'i scholar and a good friend. Uh, John Hatcher is Professor Emeritus in English Literature at the University of Southern Florida in Tampa, where he taught for 40 years. He is a poet, lecturer, translator, and author, having published 25 books, some of which have been translated into French, Spanish, Italian, Chinese, German, and Norwegian. He's also published more than 100 poems and articles and has been editor of the Journal of Baha'i Studies for the past 7 years. He has been a guest lecturer at such distinguished institutions as the University of Michigan, McGill University in Canada, the University of Maryland, Emory University, and Oxford University. He has received various awards for U.S. work, including the Hassan Balyuzi Lectureship at the 29th Annual Meeting of the North American Association for Studies on the Baha'i Faith. Together with fellow translator Amrullah Himmat, he has translated 3 books of poetry by Tahireh, a renowned Persian poet. He is presently teaching a weekly course on the Baha'i Faith, recordings of which can be found on his website, www.johnhatcher.com. Friends, I'd like to say to you that of all the publications of John Hatcher, his book called The Purpose of Physical Reality has been one of my all-time favorite books. And I suspect that everybody who is here in this crowd will say the same thing. What a great, all-time great book. Uh, we are delighted, we are honored to have John Hatcher here. Also, I want to just add one more thing. All of Dr. Hatcher's books can be found on Baha'i publications. All of his books, or most of his books, are also available on Amazon. So if you decide you want to go look at a list of his books on Amazon, feel free to do so. You will be delighted at his writing. I am so glad and honored to welcome you, John. I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Hatcher.
Thank you, Ajit. I really appreciate your kind comments, especially since I wrote them for you. Dear friends, I really am honored to be here tonight, and that you thought my comments might be worthwhile to share with you. I'm going to use in this presentation, which is not terribly deep, but I thought it might be something you might enjoy sharing with me, or my sharing with you. I'm going to use somewhat the same technique that we're using on this course, the recordings of which you can access on the website, which is johnshatcher.com. On Baha'i history, it's really more on the history of the Abrahamic religions, as seen through the lens of the Baha'i concept of progressive revelation. And that's kind of what we're going to do tonight, is to see how a Baha'i lens can take things that are complex and ostensibly chaotic and give them coherence, unity, organic structure, and simplicity. I will warn you that this subject, which borders on cosmology, is going to be a minimalist view of what in a few weeks my dear friend Stephen Phelps may cover from a more expertise, the level of greater expertise, in as much as he is a cosmologist, and a very adept one at that. So let me share my screen and begin the talk on the body of God, which sounds enticing, and I purposefully gave it a title that I thought would attract a wide audience, even though you will end up finding that I have no idea what I'm talking about. we'll begin with this concept. We're going to go from concept to concept gradually. So kind of try to follow along the logic of it. I'm beginning with a verity that I thought about as I was putting this together, that complexification based on fallacy leads to chaos, whereas complexification based on truth leads to simplification. Now, what does that mean? Well, let me see if I can illustrate it for you. We look at the heavens, and we are confounded by the complexity of it, the ostensible chaos of it. It's beautiful, but we don't understand it. And then we have someone come along with a theory that organizes that chaos for us, that gives us a lens. And we gather more information and we study that information. And we have Ptolemy come up with a theory that renders this complexity simple, logical, and relatively true. It's always going to be relatively true because truth is not absolute. And so we get this model of reality. And of course, from our modern point of view, it's wrong, but it worked for a long time and it did organize the chaos of the heavens into something that was understandable. But then we get additional information which creates epicycles and makes it chaotic again. And what do I mean? When the observations by astronomers gathered more information, they realized that if the Earth is the center, how come Mars can be closer to the Earth at one point than it is at another? So the Ptolemaic scholars said, well, let's have little cycles of Mars is going around something else. And so you end up with chaos again. So what do we do with this chaos as the Ptolemaic system becomes less and less capable of making organic and unified the observable information we have when we look at the skies? And so in the about 1500, Copernicus comes up with a theory that makes this chaos simple and logical again, relatively, again, always relative. The same data, the same information, but a different lens. And so we end up with this. The sun is the center of our solar system. And then we see the epicycles. Here you've got, for example, the moon going around the earth. Well, that would have been an epicycle for the sun. And then, of course, what he's got wrong was this sphere, which was understood to be a literal sphere of fixed stars. Well, of course, when you observe more information, you realize the stars aren't fixed as we gather more information. And so the chaos or confusion seems to reemerge the more information we get, and the more we see that it's not quite so predictable as the Copernican theory would have us believe. So we search for more inclusive theories. We apply this same process. Now we're going to switch gears. This is what we're doing in my class on the study of the Abrahamic religions. Right now we're about 7 classes into Islam. We apply the same process to religious history, which if you look at the branches of Christianity or Islam or any other religion, you see that as soon as things depart from the covenant of the founder of the religion, you get chaos. Religion seems inevitably to degenerate into schism and an array of conflicting, that should be, theories and warring factions. And so we have chaos. So what seemed to be an organizing force, such as the appearance of Moses to lead the people out of bondage, or the appearance of Christ to fulfill the messianic prophecies, suddenly the teachings of Christ become divided, and you have schism, and you have now thousands, literally thousands of versions of Christianity. So on the one hand, we can say the most widespread religion in the world is Christianity, but really the most widespread religion in the world is the Baha'i faith if you're talking about a single coherent doctrine. And so we employ the theory of progressive revelation as an organizing lens through which we view that chaos of history, and suddenly it makes sense. The Baha'i lens of progressive revelation, when employed as an overlay or lens through which to view the complexity of religious history, makes it simple and logical. The sequential, progressive, logical, organic, and eternal plan of the Creator. But then we encounter the chaotic war between science and religion. So we're switching gears to another field now. But what about the ability of progressive revelation to explain scientific observations and the scientific observations about the physical world? Because while on the one hand, the Baha'i idea of progressive revelation explains the progress of spiritual revelation from God to man, it doesn't seem to account for all of the scientific theories that will not countenance any concept of an interpenetration between metaphysical reality and physical reality, or even allow that metaphysical reality exists. So we try to apply the Baha'i lens to that problem of the agreement between science and religion, which is another theory that Baha'u'llah unfolds. And when we do this, we find Abdul Baha stating that both the physical and the metaphysical realms exist, and they exist in tandem. He states the following, and this is extremely important passage, I feel. The spiritual world is likened to the phenomenal world. They are the exact counterpart of each other. Whatever objects appear in this world of existence are the outer pictures of the world of heaven. And notice the exact counterpart, he says, not they're kind of alike. So we then defined existence as a singular reality. In other words, if we are talking about reality from this Baha'i perspective, we're not talking about two realities. We're talking about two dimensions of a single reality. There can only be one reality if by reality we mean all that exists. Reality may include various dimensions, two of which we know a little bit about, the physical and the metaphysical. However, this assertion flies in the face of most notions of multiverses, each one of which would necessarily require its own deity, but only if one accepts that there is a creator necessary for a creation. We discern the logical feasibility of an infinitely expanding social expression of that reality. Now we're switching gears again. We're applying the same overlay to the increasingly complex concept of interpersonal relationships, from family and neighbors to tribe, village, and village council as a governing administrative order, city-states, territories, and you have the constitutional governance such as that of the Ummah introduced by Muhammad. And then you have the nation state and subsidiary institutions, which really emerge much later. And then you have an attempt among nations to have some alliances and ecumenism among religions. And finally, we have a planetary state, or global governments, which is the end result of the Baha'i era, of the golden age of Baha'u'llah that we are told will emerge. But could they be something beyond that? Could there be interplanetary alliances? How do we know that once we've accomplished that unity and the ever refinable progress and of that planetary governance, that we've reached the end of our ability to be inclusive. Well, let me review very briefly what my personal journey has been in studying the social aspects of this Baha'i overlay, if you will. We begin with the individual. Know that every created thing is a sign of the revelation of God. Each, according to its capacity, is and will ever remain a token of the Almighty. Were the hand of divine power to divest of this high endowment all created things, the entire universe would become desolate and void. So, in other words, the whole reason for creation, or the whole reality of creation, is ultimately its ability to express in material form the spiritual dimension of its existence. And this begat my first book, called The Metaphorical Nature of Physical Reality, which states in effect that everything in creation is not only capable of expressing to us a process for learning about spiritual principles, but that's its sole purpose. And without it, we wouldn't have any existence. And you go to the next step, from things to people. The justification for essentially spiritual beings, namely us, taking their beginning in a physical environment, is that physical reality, as the initial stage in the endless journey of the human soul, is a precisely devised classroom whereby autonomous transformation is initiated and assisted as preparation for birth into the spiritual stage of our existence. And that is from the book to which Ajit alluded, The Purpose of Physical Reality. How do we as individuals take advantage of the capacity of physical things to mirror forth for us spiritual principles? How do we learn in this classroom that God has devised for our training? But then we realize something else. We realize that individual spiritual growth cannot take place in solitude, because the array of virtues and attributes that constitute what we call the good person require and derive from our interaction with others. That is, to create the good person requires a social context. Otherwise, our goodness is totally theoretical. So if you have an ascetic, a hermit, a Sufi, a mystic living in a cave who has become incredibly spiritual, probably never had children or even complex pets. So they've never been tested. And that brought about a book I wrote called The Ascent of Society. And The Ascent of Society explains that in order for there to be individual spiritual progress, we have to have interrelationships with others. And the more complex the spiritual, or the more sublime the spiritual virtue, the principal one of which, of course, is justice, the most precious one in the sight of God, we need to practice it on a daily basis. And furthermore, as we discover, that this can't take place in a static or singular level. It has to take place on various levels. But society in its present form does not necessarily foster such positive influence. However, the Baha'i theory of terrestrial history promises, and this is a quote, the emergence of a world community, the consciousness of world citizenship, the founding of a world civilization and culture, all of which must synchronize with the initial stages in the unfoldment of the golden age of the Baha'i era. So we go from a local community social involvement to involvement with the world itself, something we are practicing right now with the Institute process throughout the world, creating a skeletal framework for that future global model of governance. But here's a most important part of this quote from me, from the World Order of Baha'u'llah by Shawki Effendi. Furthermore, we are told that the emergence of this planetary social model should by their very nature be regarded, as far as this planetary life is concerned, as the furthermost limits in the organization of human society. Though man as an individual will, nay must indeed, as a result of such consummation, continue indefinitely to progress and develop. So in other words, once we reach that golden age of planetary unity, we haven't finished, not on this planet. We have the capability, even as an individual is capable of infinite, endless refinement. So the planetary reflection of or institutionalization of spirituality has the capacity for infinite refinement. So this is only as far as the planetary life is concerned. But what about beyond that? Well, here's the book I wrote about the planetary governance and how it has emerged in the Baha'i faith. But is there any mention in the writings about going beyond a planetary unity? And yes, there is. Shoghi Effendi, was asked if interplanetary unity would be the goal of future dispensations, or if it might be achieved in the dispensation of Baha'u'llah. Excuse me, folks. He answered, it would be a goal of the future, but science is developing so fast that it was difficult to know how soon it would come. But it might at least soon be possible to observe life on other systems that are in various stages of development, some lower and some higher than ours. Now that's Pilgrim's Notes, so it's not authoritative, but it's said in enough Pilgrim's Notes, and it's the logical outcome of our own thinking that it would seem to be a verifiable overlay on even further expansion or application of this concept. If you think about it, we can prove it. And by the way, that book, if I write it, will be called The Body of God, but it's not written. Okay. So what is the Baha'i support for such a concept? Well, let's look at it. We're going to go through a simple sequence of logical steps from the writings. By the appearance of the spirit in the physical form, this world is enlightened, as the spirit of man is the cause of the life of the body. So the world is in the condition of the body, and man is in the condition of the spirit. If there were no man, the perfections of the spirit would not appear, and the light of the mind would not be resplendent in this world. This world would be like a body without a soul. However, so in the previous slide, Abdul Baha says that humankind, in order for, has always existed, and yet this planet hasn't been. The reflection of the divine perfections appear in the reality of man. So he is the representative of God, the messenger of God. If man did not exist, the universe would be without result. In other words, creation would have no purpose. For the object of existence is the appearance of the perfections of God. And the only way that can happen is through another lecture I give on the explication of the hadith of the hidden treasure. Therefore, it cannot be said there was a time. Now, this is an authoritative quote. Therefore, it cannot be said there was a time when man was not. All that we can say is that this terrestrial globe at one time did not exist, and at its beginning, man did not appear upon it. So we know at some point man emerges through the process of evolution to appear on this planet, and then is guided sequentially and progressively by emissaries from God. But it has to conclude then, human life exists and has always existed on other planets. It's an inescapable conclusion from those two verities articulated by Abdu'l-Baha. So, can we have then a further progressively expanding sense of social reality? And we go from what we had from the beginnings of recorded history, such as a geographic area, which was the world of that reality, the Mediterranean world, for example, and the afterlife, the metaphysical world, from their point of view, was the underworld. And then we went to the global concept and the Ptolemaic perspective, and you had the Dantean underworld as the concept of the afterlife, at least if you didn't do well, and that would be within the earth. Milton used the same concept, only he put the afterlife outside the created world. Heaven was another sphere in the Ptolemaic theory. And then with the heliocentric Copernican perspective, you have total confusion insofar as a place for the, and that should be the placeless, not places, for the placeless. In other words, where is the metaphysical realm if it doesn't have a place? And of course, that's when you have the onset of the Enlightenment and the rejection of the concept of a spiritual realm. And then we go to the galactic perspective with other solar systems. The afterlife as a spiritual condition of relative nearness to God. You're more or less near to God, and we see the metaphysical realm as simply another dimension of the totality of reality. If it is a spiritual condition, it can exist in both dimensions of reality. So we can be in heaven while we're in this world, and we can be in hell while we're in this world, as we have just seen on CNN for the last week. The galactic cluster. Let's go in even further. We go beyond the Milky Way galaxy. We go beyond our solar system to the galaxy of the Milky Way, and we go beyond the Milky Way to see thousands, myriads of other galaxies, and we realize they're organized too into clusters. And so we don't know how far our organization goes. Therefore, an infinitely but organically unified, coordinated, and endlessly refinable cosmos that is an exact counterpart of the metaphysical aspect of that same cosmos. Is that what we're looking at? Or not looking at, but contemplating? But there's another problem, folks. Our sun has a little more than 22 orbits left before it degenerates and runs out of fuel and turns into a white dwarf. You can see here in this slide here, the sun is somewhere in there, in our solar system somewhere in there. As it spirals around, the organizational structure of the Milky Way, our galaxy. All right. Though probably other solar systems and other galaxies may have usurped the name, and we may be facing prosecution for infringement on their copyright of Milky Way. We'll find out. That's something else worth thinking about in all this, friends, and that is, if there are people on other planets that have access to our planet, and they have access to our planet, we would assume that scientifically they're much ahead of us. Well, if they are much ahead of us in their development, because we presume what is happening on our planet has happened before and is happening elsewhere and will happen in the future, they would no more interfere with the necessity of our going through the stages of the lesser peace, where we learn by our own error and finally choose the right way, than we would interfere with the education of a child, or than we would, if we could do it, go to a planet that was in the Stone Age and try to show them how to use an iPad. However, that still gives us approximately 4.5 billion years left to get things right on this planet. So we got a long ways to refine what we are told will occur before the end of this era, this dispensation, which is not shorter than 1,000 years, but say it is 1,000 years, in which case about 15% of it or more is already transpired. That's a good thing. Also, in spite of believing the possibility of an infinite universe, we also maintain belief in a personal God. So even though this infinity seems scary and impersonal and unspiritual and beyond anything we would like to be a part of, it's a good thing that we believe in a God that is personal. But what do we mean by that? We don't mean that God has, well, what do we mean? Let's look at the writings. By definition, God cannot assume a physical form. So what am I talking about with the body of God? And that is, God is inaccessible. God is beyond the concept of personality in the sense that we mean it. Let's look at what the writings say about this definition of a personal God. What is meant by personal God is a God who is conscious of his creation, so a cognitive being who has a mind, a will, a purpose, and not, as many scientists and materialists believe, an unconscious and determined force operating in the universe. So many people, instead of saying God, now say, well, I think the universe wants me to stay home from work tomorrow. Well, that would be a bit self-serving. So we'll use something more lofty. I think the universe wants me to go help people in Uganda. Though probably the people in the Uganda would think, according to the news, that they should come help us. To say that God is a personal reality, however, does not mean that he has a physical form, or does it in any way resemble a human being. To entertain such belief would be sheer blasphemy. And that's from Shoghi Effendi, 1939. So what we end up with is an infinite reality that still has structure. So here we have again chaos, but we overlay this concept from the Baha'i writings of it having a unity, a structure, an organization. This limitless universe, this is Abdul Baha, is like the human body, all the members of which are connected and linked with one another with the greatest strength. How much the organs, the members, and the parts of the body of man are intermingled and connected for mutual aid and help, and how much they influence one another. In the same way, the parts of this infinite universe have their members and elements connected with one another and influence one another spiritually and materially. So we can see here again a statement that would seem to confirm what I said earlier about reality being one, singular, not two realities, one spiritual and one material, but a reality that has at least two dimensions we know of, probably others we don't know of. Then creation, from this point of view, could be considered at least metaphorically, poetically, the figurative image of the body of God. And that's what I am trying to get at. The whole universe reflecteth his glory, while he is himself independent of and transcendeth his creatures. This is the true meaning of divine unity. He who is the eternal truth is the one power who exerciseth undisputed sovereignty over the over the world of being, whose image is reflected in the mirror of the entire creation, All existence is dependent upon him, and from him is derived the source of the sustenance of all things. This is what is meant by divine unity. This is its fundamental principle. Baha'u'llah. Well, that's it, friends. It didn't take as long as I was afraid it might, and I'm glad, because that leaves us more time for questions and answers. If you have questions, put them in the chat if you're on Zoom. If you're on YouTube, text them to the powers that be running this show. Right now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I am ready, and I won't say able, but I'm ready to countenance whatever questions anyone has, though if it involves calculus or mathematics, count me out.